Well, included in this year's economic stimulus bill, nearly $250,000 dedicated to cleaning up shovel-ready brownfield sites. If an experiment at one of the nation's national labs goes as planned, that could include planting shovel-ready projects. Clean Sky's Lee Patrick Sullivan is here to explain. Lee.
Well, Susan, the folks at Argonne National Lab just outside Chicago say they found a low-cost way of cleaning up contaminated areas by using the world's oldest powered solar pump.
I think this system saved the taxpayer a good amount of money so far.
At a size of nearly 5 acres, scientist Christina Negri can claim to have the largest lab at Argonne National Laboratory. Negri says she and her team may have found an inexpensive way to clean up brownfield sites, which is good news because contaminated areas of the country are so numerous the EPA and the states have a hard time coming up with a total number because the definition varies.
The U.S. Conference of Mayors tried to come up with a number of years back, and it's hard. Their range was pretty broad. It was like 450,000 to 1 million. The way I prefer to look at it when I describe it to people is that every community has brownfields or a brownfield.
One of those communities sits in the back acreage of Argonne, where for decades the lab dumped its waste byproducts, and as a result has contaminated the underground aquifer. The site was labeled a brownfield site by the EPA, and instead of getting expensive pumps to remove the contaminated water, 10 years ago, Negri decided to make it her lab and planted rows of poplar trees, which stand some 40 feet tall today.
What you see here is only the above part. What you don't see here is an equivalent length below ground, which is the depth of the roots, and that's where the roots are growing now to collect groundwater that's contaminated and is pulling up to the surface to clean it up.
The folks at Argonne teamed up with a private company and developed a tree that grows its roots straight down, more than 30 feet. The roots act as a pump and pull up the contaminated water.
And then the pollutants get partly degraded within the plant and part they evaporate out in the air, which sounds very ominous, right? But in fact, once they are in the air, these specific pollutants are not nearly as bad as when they are in the water because they degrade with sunlight.
Argonne has a similar site in Nebraska and sees a day when brownfield sites across the country will use their system.
But all summer long they've been taking up pollutants and basically transfer them through their tissue and all that.
So this is one gigantic filtering system too. It's
absolutely.
just absorbing all the
absorbing and just venting it off eventually where it gets degraded by the sunlight.
The trees essentially run on solar power at no cost, and the tree does the work of 3 commercial pumps. They also require no irrigation since their roots will seek out water deep underground. Low-cost systems like this have caught the eye of the EPA, which is monitoring the site.
EPA does support researching and looking at those and encouraging them at sites where it's appropriate, where the end use is appropriate. It's definitely an option.
Because it is an actual brownfield site, there are monitoring wells to make sure the trees are doing their job. But Negri also sees a day when the expense of several monitoring wells will not be required. Instead, all the materials that will be needed will be a $10 pair of scissors and a $1 test tube.
So we've developed a system by which we take simple vials like these, and when we are in the field we collect either a leaf or a snippet of a branch, and we put it in the vials, we cap it, they go in the lab, and they get analyzed for the pollutants in there.
So this leaf contains some of the byproducts of the pollutants?
Yes.
But there's another act to this tree story. Negri says once the trees have cleaned up a site, they can be cut down and used for biofuels. And she says she sees a day when trees and switchgrass can be planted in non-farming areas such as medians of freeways, cleaning up the toxins from the cars, then being harvested to make more fuel. And what's been the result? We're 10 years into it. How much pollutants are in a leaf like this?
Very little. I mean, you literally measure it in part per billion.
For this particular site, the trees will remain, giving the area back to wildlife.
But there may be sites, brownfield sites, that there is no commercial end use that's really viable, and that the best end use might be turning it back to green space, open space, maybe even open space and green space that won't be readily used regularly by people, but as wildlife habitat, etc.
Now, Susan, to give you an example of how quickly these poplar trees grow, this was the size of those trees just about 10 years ago. They grow about 5 feet a year, and they say within 20 years this entire 5-acre site will be cleaned up.
Wow. Okay, so Lee, this means it would take something like 30 years, though, to clean up that site. So how efficient is that, especially for the people who live there?
It's not very efficient, and the scientist Negri that showed me around her laboratory there, she said this isn't a silver bullet. This is not to be used for all brownfield sites. If there is a population downstream that's affected by this water, this isn't the best use of time. But she says they could save money on areas that aren't used for people for like subdivisions or something close by, and they could save money doing that so they can spend that money on the quick cleanup sites.
Okay, so I can add this to my collection?
Yes, you can.
Okay, thanks, Lee Patrick Sullivan.